George Washington Carver is remembered today as a creative genius who made more than 300 products from the peanut. Earlier, we traced Carver's life from his birth during the Civil War through his boyhood in Missouri. His search for education took him across Kansas and Iowa to Simpson College, and then to Iowa Agricultural College, where he earned a master's degree in agriculture. Believing that God had called him to work for the greatest good of his own people, he accepted the invitation of Booker T. Washington to join the faculty of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Hello, I'm Wintley Phipps. Please join us on this day of discovery for the Tuskegee Years, the second in a two-part series on the life of George Washington Carver, man of science and servant of God. When Dr. Carver arrived at Tuskegee Institute in October of 1896, he was eager to get to work as the Director of Scientific Agriculture. But he was shocked to discover that he had no research laboratory, no equipment, no staff, and no established courses to teach. In addition, the school expected him to live in a bachelor teacher's dormitory, 2 men to a room.
Tuskegee Institute was a fledgling young academic institution when Carver went there, inadequately prepared for doing sophisticated scientific experiments, no significant budget for doing the kind of work Carver wanted to do. So one of his first challenges was just outfitting and equipping a lab.
This is his microscope. I believe it's the one that they gave him from Iowa State that he brought with him when he came. When he got to Tuskegee, he did not find the type of equipment that he'd had at Iowa State and had hoped to find, but he managed to create it out of bits and pieces of what he found, broken bottles, plates, teacups, whatever, and managed to put together a laboratory for his students.
In retrospect, it's hard to imagine that Carver accomplished anything when you consider how many obstacles he faced. He faced, perhaps worst of all, the skepticism of white America at the time. White America did not believe that a black man could practice science. White America did not believe that a black man could do the kinds of intellectual exercises that the practice of science required. So I suppose what Carver had was his own conviction that God had ordained for him a mission to do the kinds of things that he hoped to do.
But it would take all the strength Carver could find to meet the immediate challenges. Tuskegee Institute supplied much of its own food through gardens, livestock, and a poultry farm. In addition to Carver's teaching and research responsibilities, he was expected to manage the daily affairs of the Department of Agriculture, and that was neither his interest nor his gift. The situation often left Carver frustrated and angry.
Someone who did have a temper. I think it's one of the things that becomes interesting in terms of his career here is he was a visionary. He could see where things could go. Sometimes the nuts and bolts or practicalities of some things were beyond him, or they got lost in his visions. Great inventor, not a very good poultry farm.
Booker T. Washington was also concerned about the efficient and economical operation of the Tuskegee Institute. He wanted an accounting every day of how many new chickens do we have, and how many new pigs, and how many new cows, and how much money has been spent. And Carver had the soul and the aspiration of an artist, really. And I think it probably drove Booker T. Washington crazy.
Carver did not do well as a chicken farmer for things like bookkeeping, record keeping, money making, and making a profit. He could grow the chickens. He did that all right. But there was always fussing and arguing between George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington about making the practical units like chicken, farming, hogs, making it pay.
And the strain continued throughout their life together. When Booker T. Washington died in 1915, I feel certain that Carver was being quite honest when he wrote to Booker T. Washington's widow and told her that he was heartbroken and that one of his deepest regrets was that he had never told Dr. Washington how much he valued him and how much he appreciated his work.
Carver had come to the South after the soil had been ruined by years of one-crop agriculture that was dependent on cotton. During Carver's earliest years at Tuskegee, he began teaching farmers the value of crop rotation and the soil-restoring power of plants such as peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. To reach as many people as possible, he took his message of conservation on the road. In 1897, Carver traveled in a horse-drawn wagon to visit and teach in the rural communities. Carver also organized farmers' conferences at Tuskegee where he offered practical help and encouragement. He often told his students, "Learn to do common things uncommonly well." We must always keep in mind that anything that helps fill the dinner pail is valuable. Farmers needed crops they could sell, so Carver conducted research to discover new uses for the peanut and sweet potato. In 1921, when he appeared before the House Ways and Means Committee to support a protective tariff on peanuts, he astounded the power brokers in Washington by showing them some of the many products he had made from the peanut, including flour, milk, breakfast food, instant coffee, cheese, and oil. His allotted 10 minutes was extended to nearly an hour. Honors and recognition came to Carver from many different sources.
I'm proud to come to Tuskegee because I'm proud of what Tuskegee has done.
But throughout the Tuskegee years, perhaps his greatest contribution was his quiet but consistent personal investment in the lives of other people.
I met Dr. Carver at Tuskegee, and I was his paper boy for 10 years. The Montgomery Advertiser, Birmingham News, and Atlanta Constitution. Magazine, the black newspapers, Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier. I delivered all those to him. He was a great reader. I was very much impressed with Dr. Carver. He had a very sharp mind, and he was always interested in the person that he was talking with.
Interviews that I've conducted with people who sat in George Washington Carver's class suggest to me that Carver was a very demanding professor, that he was someone who employed the Socratic method. As one student told me, Carver would not tell you anything. He would make you work for the answer. He would continually solicit an answer from you by giving you just a hint of the answer. And at times he would playfully reprimand people who seemed to him to be getting a little bit too cocky and too self-possessed about what they knew. I recall a student telling me that he started off answering one of Carver's questions one time by saying, "Now, Dr. Carver, I think," and Carver stopped him and said, "Mr. So-and-so, who accused you of being able to think?" He must have been a really dynamic, interesting teacher. Carver loved his students. He loved everyone because he saw in everyone an expression, a manifestation of God. But he loved what he was doing, and I think that love was one of the most contagious parts of his life.
He was advisor to the YMCA most of his career here. The Bible classes. The Bible class was basically a voluntary activity. The size of it was originally a small group of students, and it gradually grew to a size where they had to move it. I think the numbers that I've seen have been upward of 100 students or more.
I think the image of Carver as the scientist locked away quietly and in his laboratory without having any contact with anyone is just not accurate at all. Carver loved to play, he loved to tease, he loved to joke, and it was that personal side of Carver that made him so appealing to so many people.
Dr. Carver encouraged his students to collect and identify specimens of plants and insects. Biographer Linda McMurray describes one incident where a group of boys tried to trick Dr. Carver by constructing an insect out of various parts of different bugs. When they brought it to Dr. Carver and asked him what it was, he took one quick look at it and said, "I believe this is a humbug."
I would walk to the campus to visit my father's class in architecture and then go across the street and visit with Dr. Carver. Dr. Carver made me believe that my visit was so important. One day he pulled out of his pocket a ball of string. He said, "Little girl, look at this ball of twine. This is what you and a lot of people like you throw away when you get a package from the post office." And he said, "I save this string and I find a second use for it." I was grown up before I realized that Dr. Carver crocheted from that discarded string, embroidered, did macrame, and all sorts of things. He found a second use for everything.
I would feel that his greatest accomplishment was the love of mankind. He loved people, black people, white people, and all in between. He loved Tuskegee, and he loved the South. Henry Ford tried to encourage him to join his company in plastics. Thomas Edison wanted him to join his company, but he was against leaving Tuskegee, said that his people needed him. And I think that was a true statement. They did need him.
Imagine what it must have been like in the early 1920s when this gentle, soft-spoken black man was asked by the Congress on Interracial Cooperation and the YMCA to go into the South and speak to groups of young white males, all of whom had come, one must suspect, from highly racist, segregated families. And yet in the 1920s, somehow Carver, through his personal magnetism, his faith, his gentleness, his absolute sincerity, was able to overcome the racial hostility that whites who had grown up in the South, disassociating themselves from blacks, had always felt.
I guess it's spelled out more in the philosophy of Booker T. Washington in one of his quotations than in the ones from Carver. When Booker T said, "I will let no man drag me down so low as to make me hate him." So in action, this is the way it was with Carver. Carver was never disturbed by the negative reaction of whites to his personality, because he looked inside as opposed to looking outside. I think that made the difference.
From Dr. Carver's meetings in the South, there emerged a group of young men who wanted to share his faith and vision. Carver called them his boys.
Carver's boys were a collection of young white men who met Carver through YMCA camps or through gatherings of young men brought together by the Congress on Interracial Cooperation, and who would come up to Carver afterwards and say things that intimated a desire to get to know this wise man better. And out of those post-lecture conversations, there emerged friendships that resulted in lengthy and sometimes lifelong correspondences between Carver and these young white men, and also resulted in visits by these young white men to the Tuskegee campus.
Growing up in the South, I think that I probably had the prejudiced type of feeling that Southerners generally had then. My brother Cecil was working in Tom Houston Peanut Company laboratory back in 1929, and he met Dr. Carver there, and on January the 1st, 1930, Cecil and I took a motor trip of 42 miles over to Tuskegee, and he introduced me to Dr. Carver that morning. Until then, I hadn't realized that any black person could have a wonderful scientific mind and be exactly like the white doctors and the white scientists that I had known at college. But here was a man who equaled them in every respect. His mind and his outgoingness and his religious training and responsiveness were just so wonderful to me that it lifted me off of my feet. In the years to come, and matter of fact, in a very few weeks, he started sending us letters. It was a wonderful experience to get these letters, because frequently he'd send something personal in there, a photograph or a clipping. This was the beginning of a close personal relationship where you feel this person is not just a blob, he is somebody special for me.
In May 1933, Al Zisler was asked to drive Dr. Carver on a lecture tour for the YMCA through Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas.
My responsibilities were to drive the car, be in charge of the car, but also to carry Dr. Carver's satchel of samples of items that he created. It was interesting to see the reaction of people. You might say the crowd were on the cold side, if you want to call it that. But after the lecture, he just had that way of he smiled a lot. He answered questions, and after lectures, people just swarmed up to shake hands with him. I'm talking about white people as well as black. Of course, the thing that surprised me was he has a high-pitched voice, very high-pitched voice, and that's the result of an injury he had, I think, from whooping cough when he was a child.
The day is here. Tomorrow is lighting up the distant horizon with new and unheard of dreams, fraught with almost unlimited possibilities for everyone who is prepared to do what the Word wants done. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
When you look at the power that Carver had over audiences, and you hear this voice, you have to conclude that there was something about his overall presence that must have captivated audiences. The voice certainly didn't do it. So there must have been something about being in Carver's presence that had a magnetic effect upon people who saw him and heard him.
I've heard it said that he used to talk with God. And he'd go out early in the morning for a walk and pick up plants and things to drag into his lab. And he claims that he couldn't have accomplished for what he did, just made the discoveries for what he did, except for his touch with God.
He said, without God to draw aside the curtains, I would be helpless.
Here was a man who could go out in the morning and find God in anything and everything that he encountered, whether it was a flower, a piece of grass, a bird, a tree. He found God in everything, and because he searched for God in everything, he found him, and when he found him, he listened to the word that God sent to him for that day.
It was said that science and religion did mix, but I think it did mix with Dr. Carver. He was highly religious, and he was an outstanding scientist, and those things did mix.
What other scientist, not even Einstein, gave God the credit for what he did, or what he published? At least I'm not aware that Einstein did. But Carver never made a major move for which he took the credit for having made it. He was only the tools through which God used him to make it. That's the part that's played up less.
Dr. Carver never married. There were stories of an early romance at Tuskegee that didn't work out, but no one seems to know for sure. What we do know is that George Washington Carver gave his life in service to God and to others. He often said, "It is not the style of clothes one wears, neither the kind of automobiles one drives, nor the amount of money one has in the bank that counts. These mean nothing. It is simply service that measures success."
Carver often said to people that there should be some evidence of your having been on this earth when you leave it, that you should have been able to demonstrate that you accomplished something. And when you look back at Carver's life, you can see a great deal that he accomplished. And in the broader sense, I suppose that's what we're all trying to do. And Carver taught us how to do that, and I think that's why people continue to be fascinated with him.
When Dr. Carver died on January 5th, 1943, messages of condolence and tribute poured in from around the world. From his birth in obscurity, he had risen to great prominence. But in death, just as in life, simplicity remained his hallmark. And his grave, near that of Booker T. Washington, just behind me, is marked only by a simple stone slab. And this bench is a good place to sit and ponder the impact of one person whose goal was to help the man farthest down. Carver refused lucrative job offers from Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, choosing instead to spend 47 years at Tuskegee, He patented few of his discoveries, gave his knowledge and money freely to others, and left his entire estate to the Carver Foundation at Tuskegee. To those who knew him best, his greatest legacy was one of self-sacrifice and love. Throughout Dr. Carver's life, during difficult days of racial discrimination and personal discouragement, he always wore a fresh flower in his lapel. He took time to see the beauty of the world around him and to affirm the value of everyone, no matter what their color or station in life. One of his favorite poems was Equipment by Edgar A. Guest, and he often quoted it to close a speech.
Courage must come from the soul within. The man must furnish the will to win. So figure it out for yourself, my lad. You are born with all that the great have had. With your equipment, they all began. Get hold of yourself and say, I can.